and welcome to Inside the Admissions Office, the official podcast of InGenius Prep and your go-to resource for expert admissions strategy. My name is Jillian, and I'm excited to be your guide through this wild ride of college admissions. Each episode, I'll bring you insights from former admissions officers who know the ins and outs of getting into your dream school and their firsthand experiences reviewing applications. Our strategies have helped countless students gain acceptance to top universities, and we're here to help your students gain that competitive edge and do the same. Whether you are just starting your college prep journey or knee-deep in applications, we've got you covered. So grab your notebooks, pencils, and maybe a cup of coffee. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another exciting episode. So with us today, we have three amazing experts from US Sailing. Together, we'll uncover what it takes to navigate the college sailing recruitment process, explore essential timelines, and get insider tips on reaching out to coaches. We'll also break down the landscape of merit scholarships, take a closer look at financial aid, and also talk about what aspiring collegiate sailors can expect in the college admissions process, whether you're wondering how academic credentials fit into the picture, the impact of coach recommendations, or even the structure of tryouts, team sizes, and events, this episode covers it all. So if you're a young sailor with big dreams or a parent or mentor eager to support one, stay tuned. You don't want to miss these insights on how to chart a course toward college sailing success like this one.
I would say one big piece that coaches are looking for is your academic transcript. And it's really important to have at least 2 years of data on that before you submit it to a coach. So a very common time for sailors to reach out to coaches is their junior year. So they've had a freshman and a sophomore year of grades that they can share with a coach, and that coach can show that student, you're going to be a great fit, or this is going to be a challenging experience for you, or maybe a little too easy for you, but here's another path. So that first junior year is a great time for that first step with that academic transcript.
And this.
It's really up to the student athlete and the parents to think about what type of a college experience you want and to factor all the different things in from student life and academics, most importantly, and then also the type of sailing that you're interested in, and to make sure that you're not just looking at the top 10 or top 20 schools in the competitive rankings, and make sure that you're looking at a broad set of schools out there.
All right, without further ado, let's jump right into it. I'm so excited to have all of you here today. Thank you for joining us on this episode. So to kick things off, let's start with some quick introductions. Maybe could each of you share a little bit about your role at US Sailing and a fun fact about how you first got started in sailing?
I can kick it off. I'm John Pierce. I'm the youth racing manager at US Sailing, and I'm originally from upstate New York, Ithaca, New York, and grew up sailing there as a youth sailor. And then I went to Hobart College, which is in upstate New York as well, for my college experience. And out of college, I started coaching at Hobart as an assistant coach. And then I moved from Hobart to Stanford, then Dartmouth, and then George Washington University as a coach over the years. So had about 10 years of college coaching experience, and then moved here to US Sailing, where I'm in charge of sort of our youth racing programs and the youth performance activities that lead to the US Sailing team and things like that.
I can go next. My name is Janelle Martin. I am the youth programs manager at US Sailing. I've been in this role for about 5 years, but prior to that, I have been coaching at the college level for a very long time with Georgetown University. My journey started back growing up in Annapolis and learning to sail in Annapolis, Maryland, in lasers. So I spent a lot of time sailing by myself until I got to college sailing. And then college sailing was the first time I had to work on a team and have more people on the boat with me. But I graduated from Boston University and started coaching right away at my alma mater. So for Boston University, for Bowdoin, and then down to Georgetown for about 10 years. Love college sailing. It's been a huge part of my life, and it's led me to my career at US Sailing, which now I get to spread more of the non-competitive side of sailing, which is why I've stayed with sailing for so long, because I love having both.
All right. My name is Whitney Kent. I grew up in Wisconsin. So I grew up sailing at a small sailing school in Milwaukee. A little bit like Janelle, grew up sailing lasers, but I also sailed offshore, so larger keel boats with my family and friends. So I still do that with the same group of people. And then I coached a high school team for the last 10 years, helped them get started from nothing and then move up to having a couple of our sailors go on to sail in college. When I was in college, I sailed at the University of Wisconsin, which is a club team. It's the biggest club team in the Midwest. So I come from it from that perspective of student leadership in the non-varsity programs in the Midwest. I was Commodore of the MCSA, which is the Midwest Collegiate Sailing Association. So I have a different lens than John and Janelle, but that's a big part of college sailing too. And now I work with John and Janelle at US Sailing as the Youth Programs Associate.
Thank you for the introductions. It's actually really refreshing to meet people who grew up with a sport like sailing, especially since it's such a unique and personal experience for each of you. College sailing sounds like an exciting opportunity. Before we dive into the admissions side of things, can you give us a feel for what makes college sailing stand out? What's different about it compared to other types of competitive sailing, and what makes it such a great fit for student athletes?
Yeah, I can kick that off. So I work a lot with youth sailors who are interested in college sailing. So I had 5 key things that people should know about college sailing before diving into the specifics of admissions and everything. The first is that there's a lot of different ways to sail in college, and there's racing and competition, but there's also recreational sailing, instructional sailing. A lot of people learn to sail while they're at college via their college sailing programs. So it's a big community, and there's a lot of different types of sailing to do. And it's important that everyone knows that if you like to sail or if you want to sail, there's a type of sailing for you within your college experience. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about the governance of how it works. College sailing is governed by the Intercollegiate Sailing Association, which we call the ICSA. And college sailing is not an NCAA sport. It's actually governed by the ICSA. So the ICSA works very closely with the colleges where college sailing goes on, and it really looks the same as most NCAA sports would. But it's important to know that the ICSA is in charge. It's not an NCAA sport. U.S. Sailing are the overall national governing body for sailing in the U.S. So we are in charge of the training, the education, the rules of the sport, youth sailing and youth development, the Olympic team and the U.S. sailing team. And college sailing fits in within all of that. So we're a part of the college sailing community as well at U.S. Sailing. And many of us here on this call are passionate about college sailing. So that's why we're here. Number 3, kind of fun fact about college sailing, the ICSA competition structure is very open in that there's no Division 1, Division 2, Division 3. So all those types of schools compete against each other equally. And there's actually not really a huge distinction between varsity programs and club programs. A club team is eligible to win the national championship and defeat varsity teams at that level. Many club teams are extremely competitive nationally. And so varsity and club distinction, it might make a difference for the day-to-day of the student athlete's life, but everyone's competing against each other. So it's really no big deal. Alongside that, my 4th fun fact would be that the ICSA does not allow athletic scholarships. So you can't get financial benefits due to your athletic ability. You can, of course, still get financial benefits due to your merit scholarships or need-based financial aid, that kind of thing. But athletic scholarships are off the table with the ICSA. And then the last thing just to know about your college journey is that you definitely don't need to be recruited in order to play. It's really up to the student athlete and the parents to think about what type of a college experience you want and to factor all the different things in from student life and academics, most importantly, and then also the type of sailing that you're interested in, and to make sure that you're not just looking at the top 10 or top 20 schools in the competitive rankings, and make sure that you're looking at a broad set of schools out there that may have a type of sailing that's going to be a great fit for you during college. And don't expect that the coaches will reach out to you and initiate the recruiting conversation. It really is up to the sailor to reach out to the schools they're interested in and make sure to, it's almost like applying for a job. You want to present yourself in a very organized and professional manner so that the coaches can keep them on their radar.
Now that we know what makes college sailing so special, let's talk about the recruitment process. Can you walk us through a typical timeline for student athletes or young sailors? When is the right time to really start reaching out to coaches?
As far as recruiting, there's a few different types of recruiting for college sailing. I'd say the majority lies with who you know, and there's a very small percentage of getting asked by a coach to join a team for recruiting. So as far as explicit recruiting for talent and getting in just for sailing is a very small percentage of what college sailing is about. Recruiting would be, I have a friend from my high school that's at Georgetown University right now, and I'm starting to visit schools school, so I'd really like to visit my friend. And they happen to have a sailing team there. So the majority of recruiting ends up being people on the team, maybe coaches from some summer clinics you've done, but connections outside of like specifically being recruited for your sailing activity. As far as like a timeline for your 4 years in high school, I would say one big piece that coaches are looking for is your academic transcript. And it's really important to have at least 2 years of data on that before you submit it to a coach. So a very common time for sailors to reach out to coaches is their junior year. So they've had a freshman and a sophomore year of grades that they can share with a coach, and that coach can show that student athlete, you're going to be a great fit, or this is going to be a challenging experience for you, or maybe a little too easy for you, but here's another path. So that first junior year is a great time for that first step with that academic transcript.
Now that we've covered the timeline, why is it crucial for these student athletes to start emailing coaches after their sophomore year? What should those initial emails highlight to show they're genuinely invested in the program and the school?
Yeah, I can tackle that a little bit. I think it's very important for the student athlete to be proactive and reach out to the list of schools that you're interested in, whether it's a school that has coaches as part of a varsity program or a high-level club program, or schools that are student-led, and you can reach out to a recruitment chair or a team president. There's always somebody on every team who's going to want to know that you're interested in their school. And it's important to reach out with a nice, simple, polished email. It certainly does not need to be a college essay, but just some simple information about yourself with typically a sailing resume attached, as well as the academic information that Janelle was referring to. Try to keep your sailing resume to one page if you can. Top 5 or top 10 regatta results will be sufficient. The coaches and team leaders are very knowledgeable in sailing, so they'll know from your results roughly how you've been doing and what type of sailing you're active in. So make sure that it's concise, top 5 or 10 results, academic information on there, such as test scores, GPA, potentially a transcript attached, and then academic areas of interests. Are you looking at engineering? Are you more into the humanities? Are you not sure? Just a couple of bullet points there, because as a coach, which programs within your school are most attractive or most competitive can help the coaches understand where you sit. Certainly, you don't need to include a ton of extra information about your jobs that you've had in the past or other fun facts about your sailing interests. Feel free to sprinkle a few things in there, but really keep it to one page if you can, so that the coaches can absorb that information easily. And then just keep sending that updated sailing resume every time you reach back out to the program, so that it's always on their fingertips. Coaches are typically very busy and they don't have all that much time to devote to recruiting. And so it's not like a sport like basketball or something where there'd be a couple of dedicated coaches who just focus on recruiting. These coaches are administrators, performance analysts, mentors, academic advisors. They wear all those hats. So just recognize that they might not keep tabs on you from each moment to moment. So send that initial email after your sophomore year of high school, and then keep in touch about things like, I'm going to come visit the school. I'm swinging by to visit, and I'd love to chat and meet with the coach, or come and watch a practice. Just those type of communication pieces are good for the coaches. And don't overthink it. Don't read between the lines. If the coach doesn't get back to you, it does not mean that you're not a good candidate for the school. It may mean that they simply are very busy and missed that email. So there's nothing wrong with a few months later sending a follow-up to your top group of schools, simply saying, hey, just want to reach back out. Here's my updated sailing resume. I'm thinking about coming through town and visiting in the spring. Let me know if there's any good weekends to come check out the school. It's a pretty casual process. And then if the coaches feel like there's next steps that they want to initiate, having more in-depth conversations, then they'll get back to you eventually.
Prior to this podcast session, I was doing a little bit of digging and research about direct sailing scholarships, but I noticed that there aren't any. So I'm very curious about what kinds of merit-based scholarships can student athletes pursue? What's the best way for them to navigate the financial aid process in this sailing landscape?
Yeah, so there are no direct sailing scholarships because the ICSA is trying to level the playing field, right, between the well-funded schools and the schools that might be funded by the athletes themselves through dues and stuff like that. So you're not able to compete in college sailing if you've received a scholarship based on your sailing ability. It's different than other sports in that regard. But what they can do is use their sailing background as a way to stand out in merit-based scholarships. They're going to navigate the need-based financial aid process just the same as any other student going through the process, but they can reach out to the schools they're interested in, to those financial aid departments to help get through that process. And then also they might have a network of people they've met through sailing. They shouldn't be afraid to ask about potential scholarships just based on leadership roles on sailing teams in high school or junior sailing teams, and use that as a way to stand out for some of those merit-based scholarships from other students.
We've covered about scholarships and financial aid, but what about pre-reads? Let's dive into that aspect. And can you explain how transcripts and even test scores come into play for student athletes? For these young sailors specifically, how does their general athletic experience really influence the admissions process?
So every university is going to have a different type of sailing team. So we mentioned varsity, we mentioned club, we mentioned something in between. And so that also reflects the type of coach or student-led organization. So as far as the pre-read, I think we're talking about a pre-read would be related to a varsity team that has a full-time coach and maybe other assistant coaches that are full-time, totally dedicated. So I'd say that's like I wouldn't say the highest level, but one end of the spectrum versus a student-led club sport team. And so the pre-read is information that you're going to give this team of coaches. That's their only job, is to coach sailing and focus on developing their team throughout the year and for years to come. So they're going to want to see your transcript and they're going to want to see your athletic resume. And so that includes sailing specific things, discipline specific things, as well as where you're intending. John mentioned what department or what classes you want to take in that whole balance. In addition to the pre-read, a big question for sailors that are talking specifically with coaches that have the big picture of their team in mind is what that coach is looking for that recruiting year. Recruiting year just meaning students coming in for the next year, who they're looking to fill as students leave that are seniors, and we have freshmen coming in. They want to have a balanced team as far as sailors who are skipper specific, crew specific, maybe disciplines like a single-handed boat like lasers, double-handed boats, keel boats. Because there's so many disciplines in sailing, a coach is looking to balance all those aspects. So these pre-reads of the transcript and your athletic resume help a coach identify that you would be a good fit to fill a gap that they already have in their roster that they can see in the future. And coaches don't always look 1 year ahead. They might even be looking 2 years ahead. They're looking to make sure that their team is balanced, that they can be successful in all the disciplines, and that every coach wants to win a national championship. So they're looking to do really well and be successful, and they have that big picture in mind. So that's a little bit about the pre-reads that they're looking for.
I know we discussed this a little bit earlier on in our conversation before, but it's really clear that both academics and the athletic skill really play a role in the recruitment process. But what about the coach's opinion? How much does it influence the decision compared to academic credentials? Are there any specific schools where this dynamic is more significant than others?
Yeah, absolutely. It really does depend on the school. And I think one of the strengths of college sailing is that it's a very level playing field across Division I, Division III, club, varsity. Everyone's competing against each other. But unlike other sports, there aren't specific rules and regulations for each level the way there is in a Division I versus Division III in other sports. It's important for the student athlete to ask this question of coaches and program leaders at the schools they're in discussions with sometime in their junior or senior year. For example, it could be at a club team level. It could be that, actually, the academic advisor for the team is a very well-respected professor on campus, and they would love to write you a recommendation to go along with your admissions packet. And that may have a really positive influence on that student's application. And that's a way that a club team or a varsity team might be able to get another angle with an engineering department head or something like that, because a lot of professors are really into the sailing teams at their schools. At a more structured level, amongst the varsity programs, they may be able to go through the athletic department to liaise with the admissions office. And that could be something like a pre-read, as Janelle was saying, where the admissions office will actually look at the transcript and test scores ahead of time and give an indication of whether this looks like this athlete is going to be admissible or not. And I've worked at schools where that was the dynamic. It was really a pre-read, and then there was an indication of back to the coach that this athlete is admissible or this athlete is maybe on the yellow or the red and maybe not admissible. And then it's possible that at some schools, the coaches may have an established relationship with their athletic department and their admissions office, where consistently every year they're having a discussion of who are your top prioritized athletes. And then the admissions office takes that into account in the process. I think it's important for the student athletes to advocate for themselves in that dialogue, but also be realistic that the sailing part is really just one small piece of this really big puzzle.
Let's take a step back and look at some of the top sailing programs across the country. How do schools like Yale, Charleston, and even Stanford rank when it comes to their sailing programs?
So a lot of these schools that you're going to see as the top sailing programs in the country, like you mentioned, Yale, Charleston, Stanford, there's a handful of them that are perpetually at the top of the competitive scale. So that's probably what makes them stand out, right? Is their depth of talent and the stream, their pipeline coming through. So they have good coaching. They do a good job of recruiting to make sure they're filling gaps. There's not big fallouts from one year to the next. So that's one of the things that'll make them stand out. And as far as other top sailing schools, there's quite a few. I think there's almost 200 sailing schools with college sailing teams in the country. So like John mentioned, it's only part of the college experience. So there's a lot of them that are competitive in spurts. It only takes a few good sailors and an influx of good coaching for a couple of years to move a team up the rankings. So while the top schools can stand out consistently, there's definitely the possibility that you could hop on a team, work hard, recruit some sailors, some peers, and find some funding for a good coach and move a team up the rankings quickly.
That's actually very interesting to know, because I'm sure with rankings shifting from year to year, it's always interesting to see which schools are leading the pack. Can you maybe break down the recent national rankings for sailing programs? Which schools have made the top 10 and 20? And what does that mean for student athletes looking to get noticed?
As far as rankings, college sailing doesn't really have one set of rankings to consider. There's a few different places, and I actually tried to look some up this morning so I could have the most accurate data, and it's only from 2023. We can elaborate on a few different places to check. So there's scores at college sailing, scores.collegesailing.org. And so that shows every event that's happening. And you can see last weekend there were 15 to 20 events, and every weekend has about 15 to 20 events. And those are happening all around the country all the time, with cross conference, with in conference, with just a few schools competing against each other. So there's an incredible amount of data that needs to be considered to do a ranking. But a few places to look in the scores is that there's fall championships and there's spring championships, and then there's nationals across all sorts of disciplines. And so maybe as far as rankings, you'll see teams that are in all the disciplines all the time. So like a best overall team. But this fall, what you could look at is the showcase events. There's a semis and a finals for both women and open. And it's a chance for like about 2 weekends in a row for the top co-ed teams or open teams and top women's team to compete against each other, almost like it's an end of season nationals, but it's a fall. It's our fall championship. So that could be considered a ranking of who's the best team this fall, but they've only had a chance as their new team coming in this fall to achieve that result. You could then look back at last year's spring nationals, where that team has had a whole season to prepare. There was a semis to a finals of double-handed, and you'd be able to look in scores to see who those top teams are. And they're maybe similar between fall and spring, but there's a data point for every race you sail, and there's going to be 15 to 18 races every event. And now I'm telling you there's 6 events to consider. So there's no program that's calculating that all into who's the best team. There's also some third party, like outside of college sailing rankings. There's a Sailing World ranking, a Sail One Design ranking, and a sailrank.com. And each have their own way of coming to who they think the best team is. For Sailing World and Sailing One Design, they pull coach or either a set group of 3 coaches that are going to give a score, or 1 coach per team that actually fills out the survey to rank teams. It's a little more subjective. They're certainly looking at scores and data to give their best opinion, but that's some subjective data about who the best team is. And then Sail Rank, which is pretty new, is specific to the discipline of team racing. And it's a little more data driven and it's just starting. So it's someplace you can look as well for the best team racing teams in the country. So there's also awards that are given. So you could look into the archives of a conference gives awards, and All-American, which is a national level, gives awards. So you can see what teams are receiving awards. Those are individual. There's also a all-around team foul trophy award. So there's some awards within college sailing that you could look at, and you can see what schools are getting awards.
I feel like I'm bouncing back and forth with the questions here. I apologize. But after the recruitment process and the coach's evaluation, the tryouts would be the next hurdle, right? I'm very interested to know, what should student athletes anticipate when they get to that stage? And also, how many athletes typically compete for a spot on the team?
Yeah, again, the team size will vary. I would say a typical team size could be anything from 15 sailors to 40 or 50 on a really large team. And for a lot of teams, one of the priorities is to have very competitive practices. They may have up to 18 boats available for practice, which would be 36 athletes in those boats. It's definitely not uncommon for a team to be in the high 20s or 30s for roster size. There are some teams where there's like a competitive tryout process and cuts where sailors are going to come for the first week or two and compete in practice and get to know each other. And then the final roster gets determined at that point. Often that process is led by students as well as coaches to get a well-rounded process. So it's a good idea for prospective students to ask, what is the tryout process, if any, at each school, just to make sure that you have clarity on the fact of whether when you are admitted to the school, will you actually have a chance to participate in sailing. But unlike a lot of sports, sailing has a lot of roster spots for less experienced sailors. Some sailors even learn to sail in college. It's really not uncommon. And ask that question, certainly, but there's typically a spot for every sailor that wants to participate. And while the sailing part can be taught and learned, people who are good athletes, who are hard workers, good work ethic, good teamwork, typically rise to the top. And coaches like having those people as a part of a team. So even if you're relatively new to sailing, there might be a great opportunity for you to get involved during college. The high school competitive landscape, or for high school age sailors, there's actually a lot of different options. High school sailing is very popular, which is through your actual high school, forming a team similar to the other club or varsity teams at your high school. And so that's really popular across the country. And then in sailing, we have all these different types of boats that are called boat classes. So some of the popular boat classes for youth sailors include like the Optimist, which is the smallest boat for sort of the youngest sailors underage, like 13, 14. And then the Ilka, which is also called the Laser, which is like a single-handed boat that's also sailed in the Olympics, but it's very popular in the youth sailing scene. The 420, which is a super popular boat in the summer sailing kind of circuit. And then there's international youth classes, of which there's quite a few, which is really the top level of youth sailing. And it's where sailors can obviously compete internationally at things like the Youth World Championship, which is something that U.S. Sailing runs. So those types of boats tend to be close in type to the Olympic class boat, because the next step after that international competition is actually the Olympic level competition. So what's important to stress in all that, in the context of this conversation, is that college coaches and college programs are very good at evaluating the skill of the sailor, regardless of the type of boat specifically that they're sailing or the type of sailing they're doing. And so it's really all about fundamentals and basics and really good execution. It's important for youth sailors to recognize that the type of sailing they do as a youth sailor should really be dictated by their interests and the level of sailing that they're aspiring for and what's available to them. And they shouldn't worry about what that's going to mean in the college recruiting process, because college coaches will wipe away all of that and just evaluate you based on your skill level. And college coaches are very good at doing that. Youth sailors should enjoy it as much as possible and sail as many different types of boats as possible, and not worry too much about what that's going to mean in the recruiting process.
I'm very curious about how sailing events actually work now, because we talked a lot about team sizes and the tryouts. How are teams set up for various competitions, and what's the distinction between co-ed and women-only events that sailors need to be aware of?
So this is one of the cool things about college sailing and actually high school sailing as well, that there are opportunities for co-ed, or as it's called, the open classes now. College sailing, Janelle mentioned it. I'll just briefly summarize. We've got the open dinghy fleet racing, women's dinghy fleet racing, and the open and women's team racing events in the spring. And then there are, as Janelle mentioned as well, there's fall championships. So there's offshore, which is going to be a larger team on bigger boats. There's match racing, which is one-on-one. And then there's single-handed sailing, as well as all the dinghy fall championships. So there's a ton of different disciplines. They're each set up a little bit differently, which is great. And one of the things that makes college sailing accessible to a ton of different people with different skill sets, especially as you leave high school, maybe you hit a growth spurt, you don't fit in a dinghy anymore. There's still ways to sail in college, but the way your typical college sailing event works is you show up with a team. Let's say it's a fleet race event, which is what probably a little over half of the events are. They turn what is generally not a team sport in sailing into a team sport by combining the scores from two divisions. So you send a big enough team to field two boats at one regatta. So if the boats are two people per boat, that's not just four sailors. You're going to bring alternates, whether it's alternate skippers or alternate crews for different conditions, or just somebody that maybe hasn't had a chance to experience an event yet. Maybe you'll find a way to get them involved. It depends on the team and the event and what the goals are that either the team leaders or the coaches set up. But then you go out and one division will race two races, and then the next division races two races, and so on, until at the end of the event, you combine all your scores and the team with the lowest amount of points wins. So depending where you're sailing, this can be fleets, like Janelle said, of about 18 to 20 boats per division. Sometimes you're sailing at a venue that has two fleets of that size, so everybody's on the water all day. You get a ton of races in. Sometimes you're at a smaller school that only has one fleet, so you alternate every two races. You get some time on shore to do homework and study hard and watch your teammates compete. So there's a couple of different types of events. That's fleet racing. There's team racing events, which is 3 boats from one team versus 3 boats from another team. That one is really fun. It's become like the highlight of college sailing for most of the dinghy sailors. It's just as cerebral as it is a physical sport, which I think is one of the advantages of it for these college sailors. It's something fun to think about, a different way of attacking the sport. So we could go on and on probably about the structure of all these different types of events, but those are the 2 big ones, the dinghy fleet racing and then the dinghy team racing. And Janelle can talk a little more about this because she was closer to it than I was, but the women's team racing event is new and has been separated out from the open event. So the same women's sailors can still compete in the open event, but now there's a separate women's team racing championship as well, which is pretty cool.
Amazing. I'm learning so much about sailing today. It's incredible. So now, when it comes to preparing for college life, for student athletes who are deeply involved in sailing and balancing training with the college admissions process can be really challenging. What advice would you offer to student athletes trying to balance both? How can they best manage their time, stay organized, and keep on top of both their athletic and academic responsibilities?
I guess my advice, coming from a program where we get hundreds of emails from sailors who are really excited that my university made the list and here's all my information and I hope to hear back from you, is to be patient and persistent, because we do get so many emails. It's good to come from different avenues of my coach knows you from something, or a friend is also a sailor on the team, but be persistent and be patient, because like John said earlier in the podcast, it's usually a team of one who's tackling all of the emails, and they're still trying to run a successful team and run practice and travel every weekend and balance those 3 things that are important to them, which might be like the team, their family, and maybe something else. So my advice is to be persistent but patient when you're trying to get a hold of a coach for that first contact. And it's good to start early in junior year. That way you have a few more opportunities to reach out to them before admissions is imminent.
As with any other sport out there, I know the world of college athletics is always changing, and sailing programs are no different. How do you see the future of college sailing programs evolving, and what key trends should student athletes be aware of as they move through the admissions landscape?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a correlation between the most competitive academic schools in the country and the top sailing programs in the country. There's no coincidence there. So I think it's a great group of schools to look at when you're looking at a school with a sailing program. Chances are it's a really good academic school at whatever level. So I think that will continue to be that way. And I think sailing, unlike many other sports in college, it's really a student athlete in that it's not a very professionalized sport at the college level. And we see these trends in other sports of really professionalization going on within collegiate athletics. And sailing really, I don't think will go down that road very much. I think it's going to remain something that's very focused on academics, on the full college experience. And then obviously you have to be a very dedicated athlete to participate at the top level, just like any sport, but it's still going to be focused on your career after college, being successful there. Very few people go professional in sailing, although it does exist. And some sailors will go on to the Olympics, which is great and certainly something at US Sailing that we're very passionate about. But again, that's a pretty small group. So it's really a Corinthian sport, an amateur sport, and that's a nice fit for the colleges where it's successful. And on the women's sailing front, it's great that college sailing offers so many opportunities for female athletes because there are dual competitive tracks. There's open competition as well as women's only competition. And we've seen in the last few years some examples of the all women's teams winning both the women's national championship and the open national championship. So it really is quite a level playing field. Stanford University 2 years ago won both national championships, or certainly won the Open National Championship with a almost entirely women's team and just an amazing group there. So I think we're going to see that trend continue because it really does lend itself to open competition, regardless of gender. It's just a competition of sailors.
The path to collegiate sailing isn't always as straightforward as it seems, and it requires both skill and strategic planning. So with all of that in mind, what is the one key piece of advice all of you would offer aspiring sailors looking to compete at a collegiate level, and what steps can they really take to improve their chances of being recruited?
You're definitely going to mess it up, and that's okay. I think everyone struggles with it in a different way at a certain time. But I think part of the balance and being too busy makes you more focused. And so you have to embrace that a little bit. So I think the busier you get, the more things that are important to you, the more things you're trying to fit in. It should focus your time and what's important each day, and it should ultimately help. So although it could be a big change and it can be a transition period, maybe that first year, but some good advice I got is that you need to focus on 3 things and do those 3 things well, and forgive yourself for the things on the outside, or reshuffle and reassess what your top 3 are. So 3 things, meaning, let's say academics is most important. You've worked with your family, you're paying a lot of money for this university experience, you want to graduate on time. And so academics is in the top 3. The sailing team has become really important to you. You really like all the people involved. It's your competitive need to go out and win things, but it takes a lot of time. So if that's in your top 3, you have to prioritize that time. But you realize you only have one other piece that you can fill that you can be really good at. And you need to forgive yourself that you can't do everything all the time really well. But if you can resort it to the top 3 and make sure that it helps you refocus what you need to do. Everyone gets there at a different time in a different way. But one of my best experiences in college sailing is that the coach, my friends, the leaders on the team when I first started were really helpful in getting me balanced really quickly. I could see teammates who were seniors who were doing the same thing, that had the same degree, that were helping me on my way. So college sailing provides so much in that way. So being balanced takes time. Everyone's going to get there in a different way, but college sailing and that leadership network and your friend network can really help you.
I guess maybe 2 things. One, if you're really into sailing, develop yourself as a sailor as much as possible, both within competition and also just learning and being a student of the game. Sailing is an interesting sport in that youth sailors can often compete against adults as well. So unlike most sports, it's not uncommon for a talented 14-year-old to be sailing against a bunch of 30 and 40-year-olds in a competition. And that's a good thing because that makes you better. So just focus on your sailing and your skill level as much as possible. Don't worry too much about the results, but worry about the sort of the depth of knowledge and the ability that you're building up. So that's from a sailing perspective. And then I think from the recruiting and admissions perspective, just recognize that it's really the onus is on the sailor rather than the coach or rather than even the parents to identify the schools that they're interested in and be proactive about reaching out to those schools, staying in touch. I think one of the most crucial steps is to go on an in-person visit sometime during your junior year or between your junior and senior year and see all the schools you're interested in person and get a feel for, does this feel right from the intangible perspective? Could you see yourself here? Often when you interact with the students at a school during your visit, you're either going to feel like these are people that you feel at home with, or you might feel another way and feel like, wow, this like campus culture is a little different than what I expected. And maybe I don't like that. But just doing that research, and it's really, the coach is not going to do that for you. And really the parent shouldn't do that for you either. It really should be the student who makes that call. And obviously there's so many good choices out there that chances are you're going to land somewhere great. But just being proactive, it's almost like applying for jobs. You want to put your best foot forward and not wait for the job to come to you. You have to go out and find the opportunity that's going to be best.
Mine would be one that John mentioned earlier, and I think I reiterated, which is keep your options open and work hard at making yourself a qualified student as well as a qualified athlete to all of these different places. So a lot of the top sailing schools in the country are also some of the hardest to get into. And if your coach only has less than a handful of names that can help through the admission process, you still have to be a qualified student. And at the end of the day, you're going to graduate from college sailing and go on to your full-time job or work with Janelle and I at US Sailing. And you want to make sure that you're set up for success in the sport of sailing, of course, but also above and beyond that in whatever it is comes next for you. So my advice to my high school students was to work hard at school, work hard at sailing, but it's got to be a balance of both. And you have to be a qualified student as well as a qualified athlete to get into all of these schools. Sailing alone can't get you there.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you would like to speak to one of our experts, you can set up a complimentary strategy call with one of our enrollment counselors by following the link in our episode description. And for more information and access to additional resources, you can register for our webinars, which is also linked in the episode description. If you have any questions or would like to request a topic for a future episode, you can email me directly at jillian.yong, that's JILLIAN.YONG@ingeniusprep.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Inside the Admissions Office, and don't forget to follow the podcast so you're notified every time a new episode is available. That is all for now, and I hope this was helpful for everybody tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode.